Mutual Treason by Andrew Buchanan. Read by Bryan Patrick Stoyle. Xynka had just finished licking his plate clean and was tossing it in the sink to sanitize later when his mail alert chimed. He crossed his kitchen to where a stubby partial wall separated it from the living room and pressed the heel of his paw against a lever, and a data chip dropped into his pads. It was unlabeled, the sort of thing that messages were sent on, received, wiped, and then sent back out on all throughout Gendiri space. The lack of a sender tag was concerning, however. He crossed to his workstation and plugged it in. Detecting the presence of the chip, the computer booted and ran the simple message algorithm on the chip, displaying it for Xynka. Or rather, an absolute mess of Unicode characters which could be from any of some 10,000 languages from 17 different species. Physical chips being passed around gave the illusion of security, but Xyn knew that Pilatershek Station had received a transmission with a destination tag, dumped the transmission to a chip, and routed the chip to his quarters. Anyone could have intercepted the transmission, either in transit or even before it was sent to Pilatershek. And that's why encryption like this was used, the kind of encryption that Xyn could decode himself, but that scant few others could. He pulled another data chip off his neckpiece and plugged it in. It ran a low-level decryption, the kind of thing that civilians wouldn't have access to, but wasn't the hardest thing to decrypt, essentially whittling down the entirety of Unicode, a human standard, one of their many contributions to the bureaucratic efficiency of the galaxy, to the character set of a single language in Gendiri script. A messy jumble, but almost familiar-looking. Decently expected. Many Gendiri Information Bureau encryption schemes set that as the first step, and the resulting jumble was one that Xyn could now decrypt on his own. It took him some time to do so. Character substitution, a couple of different methods to try, but eventually done. This resulted in an obscure language that isolated communities of Gendir still spoke, one that Xyn was fluent in. But it wasn't quite right. The words were familiar, but they didn't make sense in that context. He translated the text into collective Gendir to try a few more decryption schemata. In one, literally taking a chip of the latest edition of the Pehendrith University Collective Gendir Dictionary and shifting every word down 12 entries. Some sentences almost made sense. The fragments he got, and the difficulty of decryption, had at this point made him very nervous, his heart's pounding and alternating staccato in his chest. On a hunch, he went back to the original character decryption, and, after digging the appropriate chip up from its file folder, shifted those words down their respective dictionary, not updated nearly as recently. Dying languages don't get the luxury of regular dictionary updates. That resulted in, well, more for double-checking his work and allowing him a moment to take it in than any actual need to read it clearly. He translated into collective, then sat back from his desk, looking at the workstation screen. Read, destroy, proceed, acknowledge. Human technology, stealth field, personal. Present. Pilatershek Station, custody, Cassidy Scott. Digital blueprint, confirmed. Physical prototype, suspected. Obtain, all. Immediate return, all. Personally. Without even acknowledging that he'd received the message, he was to go and steal data and possibly hardware for something he hadn't even heard about until reading this. And he had to steal it. From Cassidy, his friend, and or rival, similarly employed as himself, but for the Terran Intelligence Agency. Well, nothing to do but get to it. He'd allowed himself a second to sit back and absorb. Now, it was past time to get to work. He pulled the chips out of his workstation and it powered back down. He then tossed the dictionary chip in a bowl for later refiling and reattached the decryption chip to his neckpiece. Finally, he plugged the message chip into a surge port, which fried the internals, and singed his fur while it was at it. Nothing to do about it, time was of the essence. Then pierced it with a canine tooth, then pocketed it. There was more he could do, but it would have to wait until after he'd stolen this mysterious human technology. He left his quarters and worked his way quickly down the hall and around the corner. Under the guise of keeping an eye on foreign intelligence agents, Xynka had ensured that Cass's cabin was close to his own suite. Usually, though, it was because they genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Keep your friends close, he remembered Cass saying about the arrangement, and your enemies closer. He got to Cassidy's door and hit the panel for it to open. To his mild surprise, it opened on command. Unlocked. Was she here? That'd make things difficult. But no. He stood in the doorway, scanning the cabin. The workstation was on, but Cass was nowhere to be seen. Maybe the door had been locked after all, and the station just recognized his access override immediately for once. Sure, that was it. Wait, had he locked his own door on the way out? He thought so, but he wasn't positive. Even if he had, it'd stop almost anyone on the station but Cass. And she had no reason to get in there right now, right? She wasn't here. She's not here. She wouldn't know he wasn't in his quarters. She's not here. After scanning the room for a minute too long, he stepped into the room and over to the workstation, the door behind him staying open a moment longer, then sliding shut behind him. He knew that humans preferred integrated onboard storage systems rather than the chip and display system used by the Gendir, and just over half of the other species in the known galaxy. He'd used such operating system-style workstations before, but it took him some time to realize what he was looking at on Cass's screen. Sector counts running up, past 2 of 7. It was wiping its hard drive. Cass had known he was coming after all. She must have. No, stop this and get the data first. Then he could worry about Cassidy Scott. He sat at the workstation and flexed his digits, taking stock, trying not to panic. On a Gendir workstation, he could just pull the chip with the data. But conversely, a data chip could be completely wiped in mere seconds. The bits of metal and plastic in his pocket could attest to that. In this case, the human workstation was a blessing. It gave him some time to work, as fast as he could with the almost familiar human keyboard. He started by attempting to seize up its processes, but it kept chugging along, writing ones to the sectors of the drive. He grabbed an override chip from his neckpiece and plugged it in. In theory, it should stop the processor in its tracks and reboot the machine from the software on the chip. No luck. Xyn realized that it was overwriting the entire drive, including the operating system. So whatever process was running wasn't at the software level. There was some hardware somewhere telling the processor what to do. He checked the rest of the ports on the front and back of the station, but nothing was plugged in aside from the input devices. There was a power cord, though. He chastised himself and pulled it. All he needed was the drive. He didn't need to perform the data recovery on this workstation in situ. The workstation, now disconnected from the wall, kept going, nearing the end of its third pass, alternating ones and zeros to the drive. Battery. Damn. He removed the side cover from the machine. He could try to just pull the hard drive out. Just because humans didn't use chip and display systems didn't mean that the data wasn't, after a fashion, removable. But a potential power surge, and burnt fur, could wipe the drive more surely than any methodical data wipe could. Xyn was left to wonder why that wasn't Cass's first option, and decided that, possibly, a fried drive might have some random data still intact. Maybe it'd fry at the end of its 7th pass. He looked up at the display, starting its 4th pass, increasing numbers of 1s and 0s next to each other until repeating, probably a prime sequence. Someone had fun designing the wipe algorithm. Xyn wasn't having fun stopping it. He looked at the motherboard for any anomalous chips that might be driving the data wipe. Nothing. He looked for something attached to the drive, maybe bypassing the workstation's hardware. Nothing. He looked again at the outside ports. Still nothing. Just the input devices. Wait. He unplugged the keyboard. The screen froze, then shut off. He picked up the keyboard and looked it over. What's a more convenient panic switch than a button that's already at your fingertips? He carefully removed the drive and hoped he'd recovered it soon enough that Gendir Xenotech data recovery specialists would be able to get what was needed. On a whim, he took the keyboard too. Though he doubted it was anything overly complicated, it wasn't a countermeasure he'd run into before, and it was surely worth something to somebody. He left Cass's cabin and headed back for his own suite. Now that he'd recovered the drive, and hopefully the data thereon, he could spare a thought for the human agent. He hadn't considered, not for a moment, the prospect of not fulfilling the task set forth for him by his superiors. Now he took a moment to determine if he regretted his actions, and no, he didn't. They both knew that this was a possibility, and just as with other acquaintances he'd made along the way, he'd kept her at arm's length. He'd missed the friendly aspect to their rivalry, but he'd move on. Maybe not immediately, but soon. Xynka palmed the panel for his suite, and the door unlocked and slid open. Again, he scanned for Cass. She wasn't at his workstation. She wasn't rifling through his data chips. And besides, the most valuable chip in the suite, in the entire station, wasn't even... Oh, Frel. Read. Destroy. Human technology. Stealth field. Personal. Recovered. Human data storage. Wiped. Digital blueprint. Data recovery. Required. Physical prototype. Not present. Cassidy Scott. Not present. Cleaning. En route. Complication. Data chip. Digital blueprint. Subspace drive. Missing. Cassidy Scott. Suspected. This agent. Recall. Deliver human data storage. Offer resignation. Surrender for arrest. This was the message that preceded Xynka as he swept his suite of any remaining valuable intelligence and either disposed of it or clipped it to his neckpiece. Assuming he'd be afforded the privilege, he'd have to recover his model collection some other time, or start building it anew. He assumed that, considering the true significance of his most recent acquisition and its subsequent loss, he would not in fact be afforded the privilege. He sent another message to the station's spaceport to be on the lookout for a human matching Cass's description, trying to make the next jump ferry to Earth, but didn't hold out much hope. Depending on the efficacy of whatever this stealth field technology was, she could bypass any security checkpoint and have her pick of ships with nobody, not even the crew, any the wiser. And finally, he boarded a personal flitter, hardly more than a starfighter with a passenger seat, piloted by a Bureau agent, and set home for Gendarin to deliver the data, his report, his resignation, and, should he choose to even offer one, his defense. Surprisingly, however, his superiors only accepted the first two. Oh, to be sure, there was a lot of noise made. How could he lose such valuable intel? What form was it even in? Wait, why did he have it in the first place? Who made that decision? And outrage and uncertainty rang up and down the halls of the Bureau, ultimately fizzling out without anyone losing so much as a paycheck over it. It was about the time that he was tasked with the operational security of the labs working on stealth tech. Because yes, due to molecular alignment, or something undoubtedly quantum, the data had been, to some extent, recovered, and needed only relatively simple legwork to get the gaps plugged up. Then the real fun, it was said, could begin. That Xyn considered the possibility that someone had intentionally leaked subspace travel technology to a foreign power, quite possibly to humans specifically, via the relationship that he had formed with one of their best agents. Xyn had been set up to lose this tech, so the reasoning went, and if that were the case, then he was grateful that whoever this traitor was, they had at least exerted the common courtesy to keep Xyn's tail out of the coals. Xynka's work at the lab complex was a far cry from what he'd been doing previously, but good security consultants became so by knowing all the ways that a system could be attacked, and could therefore anticipate incursions from multiple conceptual angles. And Xynka's previous work had made him a very good security consultant. After the labs were set up, it was almost a quiet posting. Almost. It was quiet indeed from a security standpoint. He stayed vigilant, rotated out those under him who got hopelessly complacent, and had nary a search network bot come sniffing at his firewalls. But then, it wasn't a quiet posting, because stealth field technology was just so damn loud. The labs had started by recreating the blueprints as best they could reproduce them. That meant a belt that one could wear with machinery woven into it, and a somewhat chunky box to one side of the clasp. At this person-sized scale, the belt let out a quiet, yet still audible hum. Not much use, that, since most species would still be able to hear it. But then, sound doesn't transmit in a vacuum. So what about scaling it up a bit? It was clear from the blueprints that humans hadn't scaled the technology at all. So this was new ground. New and noisy. The volume of the sound generated ramped up commensurately with the volume the field was meant to contain. Hiding a flitter in a docking bay made it hard for anyone nearby to hold a conversation. Making photons dance around a corvette was uncomfortable, verging on painful. And crews of larger vessels had permanent hearing damage to look forward to if they were stealthed for too long. Curiously, the labs were told to install what they had onto a small fleet, testing long enough to confirm it'd work, then keeping the prototypes installed rather than continually experimenting on them. Iterate, they were told, but who knows when we'll have need for them. Someone did know, apparently, because shortly after the fleet was outfitted, it was mobilized. Xynka, the ranking Bureau member on site, received the dossier and couldn't believe the in-flight briefing he was about to give. "Why the rush?" Xynka heard as he entered the briefing room. "The next interval isn't for another 2 hours." "In 2 hours it'll be too late," Xyn responded as he took his position on the dais at the front of the room. He locked eyes with the officers present, of the Hidden Tooth, flagship of this small fleet, and the remote holographic avatars of officers on the other ships, all of which were rigging onto the gantries of a relatively small jump ferry. That is why the Dawnbringer's navigation system is not synced to the interval, he continued once he had everybody's attention. As soon as everyone is attached, we're jumping. Gasps went up in the room. A jump off the interval? Madness! We're pressed for time, so excuse me if I keep things simple. Does anyone know why we adopted the interval in the first place? To ease travel schedules? Side effect. To balance some sort of emissions? Yes, Lieutenant. Correct. Mu radiation. Why is it important that this be evenly distributed? He saw someone almost put a paw up, who then thought better of it. Xyn locked eyes with the officer and said, "No stupid answers." The officer swallowed, then hesitantly said, "The destroyers?" Laughs went up in the room. The officer who said it looked embarrassed, until she saw that Xyn wasn't laughing. Then her fur seemed to grow 3 shades paler. Yes, the destroyers. Thought by our ancestors to punish us for taking to the stars. Thought to be the retribution for spacebound hubris. We found out long ago that they're attracted by mu radiation. So we spread it out, so there isn't a target. So we keep our jump ferries large, and move as much mass as possible for every jump. And we were so successful that the destroyers faded to myth and children's fables. And because we used the interval, and kept that technology to ourselves, they stayed there. Then, Xyn sighed, a note more theatrically than was strictly needed. Then, humans happened. A nervous chuckle went around the room as he steadied his voice before continuing. Somehow, humans have obtained subspace jump technology and have been testing it with enthusiasm. We wouldn't have even known until some old mu radiation buoys started showing off-interval readings. This was the absolute truth, and also a convenient excuse to discover humanity's use of the tech. The readings seemed like a bug at first, but no. And that's why we know where we're going, a deep space facility of some sort, and none too soon. He pushed another image to everyone's displays. An hour ago, we got confirmation of transverse polarization of the mu radiation pattern. The destroyers are back, and it's up to us to pull the humans' tails out of the coals. He nodded at the Hidden Tooth's captain, who took Xyn's place at the dais, and said to the rest of the room, "All right, you heard the spook. The primates got hold of fire and are gonna burn themselves, and we're gonna slap it out of their paws. To your stations. Is everyone linked up?" Most of the remote hollows nodded. The last one held up a digit, fuzzed slightly, then said, "Just finished." "Great. Dawnbringer Bridge, let's get to this deep space lab." "Agent," called the comms officer, "message for you." He handed Xyn a message chip. Xynka frowned and plugged it into a nearby reader, scanning it quick. It had better be important to come in. "Captain, we're going to have to set a new course." Xynka stood on the bridge, out of the way. He was no longer directly involved in the execution of the operation, having delivered his briefing, but his presence and first-hand account would still be valuable to the Bureau. Xyn looked out of the bridge viewports, the Hidden Tooth dropping away in front, then the expanse of the Dawnbringer, which the tooth was attached to the side of. The rest of the fleet was holed up inside the hollow vessel. In front of all of them, a bright subspace rift was opening. "Dawnbringer, forward! All ships stealth on my mark!" The captain watched as the rift drew closer. Then, just as the prow of the jump ferry brushed up against the rift, he said, "Crews, brace! Mark!" Normally, a subspace transit sounds like the ship is getting stressed slightly. Some creaking, a twisting sensation felt as much as heard for a couple seconds until emerging on the other side of the portal. This time, it sounded awful. There was no sound like it. Nothing grounded in Xynka's experience. It was pain, like none he'd ever known, even through the hearing protection everybody was wearing. The fleet emerged, and a yellow icon with a black slash across it appeared on the screen of every crew member in the fleet. Detach! Proceed! In the hastily agreed-upon visual parlance they'd set out ahead of time. As they did, the bridge crews looked out and saw not some deep space outpost, but the blue orb of Earth in front of them. Nearby, a civilian jump ferry was facilitating an evacuation from humanity's homeworld. And ahead, the stuff of nightmares, of children's stories. The stuff that may have destroyed countless civilizations until the Gendir learned not how to defeat them, but how to hide from them. The destroyers, attacking the defense fleet of humanity. Magenta indicators lit up on the captain's screen. When enough ships indicated that they were free of the Dawnbringer, he sent the next command. Red and white. Flank. And when everybody sent another magenta confirmation, a flag of teal and tan, then teal and red. Reveal. Attack. The pain stopped as the hidden tooth turned off its stealth field. And while the ambush was messy, some crew were likely fully incapacitated by this point, it was still effective, catching the destroyers unawares. The humans surged forward in return, and the battle unfolded in a silent ballet. Wait. Aren't there supposed to be auditory simulators? Why don't I hear anything? Why aren't the crew communicating? Oh. He looked around and saw that many crew members were bleeding from the ears, indeed trying to shout to each other, but neither Xyn nor the rest of the bridge crew could hear. They sometimes were able to flag someone else's attention and attempt a sort of somatic communication. And somehow, they prevailed. And soon the final ship in this vanguard of the destroyers broke up, its pieces spinning away from each other. They had prevailed. A few years later, Xynka, decorated for his part in obtaining stealth technology for the Gendir and in bringing the rescue fleet to the defense of humanity, was enjoying a sort of retirement on Femresser Station, a desk posting as more of a formality to fill his time than for processing any crucial work. It wasn't that the deaf had no place in the Gendiri Information Bureau, just that Xynka had expressed his desire to retire, and he was too valuable to fully let go of. Cassidy was also on the station, likewise none the worse for wear for Xyn having taken the technology she'd been custody to. Xyn was very happy that they had been able to catch back up and reforge their friendship. They were even able to talk a bit more openly, their respective secrets revealed to, stolen by, each other and, if in fact, if not in methodology, known to the greater galaxy. And so it was that, after licking his plate clean and tossing it into the sink, a panel lit up, presumably accompanied by a noise of some sort. But Xyn didn't know, and long ago stopped caring. He pressed the heel of his paw against a lever, and a data chip dropped into his pads. It was unlabeled. The decryption was familiar. He'd used it only once before in his life. Read, destroy, proceed, acknowledge, human technology, energy defense shield, personal, present, Femresser Station, custody, Cassidy Scott, digital blueprint, confirmed, physical prototype, suspected, obtain, all, immediate return, all, personally. He leaned back and looked at the message. identical wording, identical encryption, identical instructions to do the thing first and ask questions later. And he'd just received blueprints for another proprietary piece of Gendiri technology. He considered responding to the message, but shook his head. He fished the blueprint chip from a potted plant, clipped it to his neckpiece, and left his quarters. He had a meeting to attend. This has been Mutual Treason, written by Andrew Bugenis, read by Bryan Patrick Stoyle. The Destroyers will return in How We Stop the Destroyers, available now wherever audiobooks are sold. Thank you for listening.